If you've ever looked at photographs from World War II, watched old combat footage, or played a naval video game, you've probably noticed one type of ship appearing over and over again. It's not always the giant battleships like USS Iowa or USS Missouri. It's not even the famous aircraft carriers like USS Enterprise. Instead, it's a much smaller ship, the Fletcher-Class destroyer. Whether the U.S. Navy was escorting aircraft carriers, hunting submarines, bombarding enemy beaches, rescuing downed pilots, or fighting Japanese warships in the middle of the night, chances are there was always at least one Fletcher-class destroyer involved. So why were these ships absolutely everywhere during World War II? The answer is that they were some of the most versatile warships ever built. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the Fletcher class and why it was designed, how it fought, and why it became one of the greatest destroyer classes in naval history. During the late 1930s, the United States knew that tensions around the world were growing. Japan was expanding across Asia. Germany was rapidly rebuilding its military. The U.S. Navy realized that many of its older destroyers were becoming outdated. Earlier destroyers had been built under strict naval treaties that limited displacement and firepower. Those restrictions forced designers to make compromises. But as war became more likely, those treaty limits no longer mattered. The Navy wanted something bigger, faster, longer range, and much more heavily armed. The result was the Fletcher class. The first ship, USS Fletcher, entered service in 1942, and she immediately showed what the new design could do. One reason Fletcher-class destroyers seemed to be everywhere is because they actually were. The United States built an astonishing 175 Fletcher-class destroyers during World War II. That is an incredible number when you remember how complex warships are. They weren't built in just one shipyard either. Shipyards across the country worked around the clock, turning out new destroyers at an unbelievable pace. As each new ship entered service, it was immediately assigned somewhere it was desperately needed. Some went to the Atlantic, most went to the Pacific. By 1944, it was difficult to find a major American naval operation that didn't include multiple Fletcher-class destroyers. Before we continue, it's worth explaining what a destroyer actually does. A destroyer isn't meant to fight alone against battleships. Instead, destroyers are designed to protect larger ships while still being dangerous enough to fight on their own. Think of them as the bodyguards of a fleet. If enemy submarines attacked, the destroyers hunted them. If enemy aircraft appeared, the destroyers opened fire. If enemy destroyers or cruisers approached, the destroyers engaged them. They were expected to do almost every job imaginable. That flexibility is why the Fletcher class became so important. One of the Fletcher's greatest strengths was speed. They could reach over 35 knots or about 40 miles per hour. That might not sound very fast today, but for a warship weighing over 2,000 tons, it was incredibly impressive. That speed allowed them to keep pace with America's fast carrier task forces. Aircraft carriers couldn't afford slow escorts. Luckily, the Fletcher class had no trouble keeping up. Despite their size, Fletcher destroyers packed serious firepower. Their main battery consisted of 5-inch dual-purpose guns. These weren't just anti-ship weapons. They could also fire at enemy aircraft. That made them extremely valuable. As Japanese air attacks became more frequent later in the war, these guns helped create a protective wall of fire around the fleet. In addition to main guns, Fletcher destroyers carried dozens of anti-aircraft weapons, including 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. As the kamikaze threat grew during 1944 and 1945, many destroyers received more anti-aircraft weapons. The Fletcher wasn't just defensive, it could also attack. Each ship carried 10 torpedo tubes loaded with the famous Mark 15 torpedoes. While torpedoes had mixed success early in the war due to technical problems, improvements eventually made them much more reliable. Against enemy cruisers, destroyers, and even battleships, torpedoes were one of the Fletcher's most dangerous weapons. Sometimes a single well-placed torpedo could cripple a much larger ship. Destroyers were also the Navy's primary submarine hunters. German U-boats in the Atlantic and Japanese submarines in the Pacific threatened supply lines and troop transports. Fletcher destroyers used sonar to locate submarines hidden beneath the surface. Once they found one, they attacked using depth charges. Later in the war, many ships also received the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, which increased their chances of destroying enemy submarines before they could escape. Without destroyers protecting convoys, thousands of soldiers and millions of tons of supplies might have never reached the battlefield. Perhaps the Fletcher's most important mission was protecting aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers were the most valuable ships in the fleet. Without them, American naval air power disappeared. Destroyers formed a protective ring around each carrier group. If submarines appeared, the destroyers attacked. If enemy aircraft appeared, the destroyers filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire. If injured pilots landed in the ocean, destroyers often raced in to rescue them before enemy forces could. They rarely received headlines, but carrier operations depended on them. Fletcher destroyers participated in nearly every major Pacific campaign. They fought in the Solomon Islands, they supported operations around New Guinea, they escorted carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they participated in Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. They bombarded the beaches before the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They escorted transports carrying Marines and soldiers. Wherever the U.S. Navy went, the Fletcher-Class went too. If one Fletcher destroyer deserves special recognition, it's the USS Johnson. During the Battle of Samar on October 25, 1944, Johnson faced an impossible situation. A powerful Japanese force, including battleships and heavy cruisers, suddenly appeared. Johnson was badly outgunned. Her captain, Commander Ernest E. Evans, didn't retreat. Instead, he ordered his destroyer to charge directly towards the enemy. Johnson fired torpedoes, attacked Japanese cruisers with her guns, laid smoke to protect American escort carriers, and continued fighting despite taking devastating damage. Eventually, she was sunk. But Johnson's actions helped save the escort carrier she was defending. Her crew's bravery became one of the greatest stories in U.S. Navy history. Life aboard a Fletcher destroyer wasn't easy. The ships carried around 330 officers and sailors. Space was extremely limited. The Pacific Ocean was hot and humid. Storms constantly battered the ships. Crew members stood long watches, maintained equipment, loaded ammunition, fought fires, and repaired battle damage. When under attack, everyone had a job. Even cooks and clerks became damage control teams if the ship was hit. It was exhausting work, but the crews kept these ships operating under some of the toughest conditions imaginable. When the war ended, the Fletcher-Class wasn't finished. Many ships continued serving during the Korean War. Others were modernized and fought during the Vietnam War. Some were transferred to Allied navies around the world where they served for decades. A few remained active into the 1990s. That's an incredibly long career for ships originally designed before World War II. So let's go back to our original question. Why were the Fletcher-class destroyers everywhere? Because they could do almost anything. They escorted carriers, protected battleships, hunted submarines, fought enemy destroyers, bombarded beaches, rescued pilots, escorted convoys, screened amphibious landings, and supported nearly every major operation in the Pacific. The United States built 175 of them because the Navy needed ships that were dependable, flexible, and capable of handling almost any mission. The Fletcher-Class delivered exactly that. While aircraft carriers and battleships usually receive most of the attention, many historians consider the Fletcher-Class destroyer to be the true workhorse of the U.S. Navy during World War II. Without them, many of America's greatest naval victories would have been far more difficult, or perhaps impossible. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to Eli's Naval History for more stories about the ships, sailors, and battles that shaped history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.